Hello, and thank you for listening to the Testing the Spirits podcast. In this episode, I want to address the question, is wokeness a secondary issue? Is wokeness a secondary issue? So I'm going to be using the upcoming Shepherds Conference at Grace Community Church as the example, formerly hosted by John MacArthur and Phil Johnson of Grace to You, Grace Community Church. So they're just about as conservative as you can get when it comes to mainstream evangelical Christianity. Of course, John MacArthur went home to be with the Lord this past summer, but a lot of people have been wondering, what in the world is going on? I already did one video on this, but since Grace Community Church has decided to bring back some of these woke teachers, such as Mark Dever and Ligon Duncan, also, John Piper is going to be there. This clip that we're going to listen to in a moment, Phil Johnson, listen, I know someone's going to say, oh, they're not woke. Well, Phil Johnson is going to admit that Mark Dever is woke. And without question, Ligon Duncan is woke. After all, he wrote the foreword to the book, Woke Church. And then along with those two, Al Mohler and John Piper are going to be speaking at the upcoming Shepherds Conference in 2026. People debate how woke Al Mohler is, but Piper writes for TGC, the Gospel Coalition. So certainly he has expressed woke views, and Mohler as well. So we're going to listen to a clip of Phil Johnson in a minute, just explaining why these men are being invited. Clearly, their wokeness is being treated as if it's a secondary issue. If it were a primary issue, something like if it was treated like the resurrection of Christ, they denied the Trinity or the resurrection, then definitely they would not be speaking. So the fact that they are speaking, yes, their wokeness is being treated as a secondary issue. And that's the question of this podcast. Is that the right thing to do? Is that the right approach? So I think that when it comes to wokeness, I'll leave a link that I did a whole lesson on this topic, but basically, just for the definition, there are still a few people who don't know what wokeness is. It's tied in, obviously, with social justice, liberalism, even Marxism, identity politics, critical race theory. I don't want to spend a lot of time defining it, what it means to be woke, because I think just about everybody gets it by now. But here's why this matters, even more in regards to the Shepherds Conference. John MacArthur was probably the most outspoken pastor in all of the nation when it came to this subject of social justice and just being woke. MacArthur said that social justice in particular, and you can't separate being woke from social justice, you just can't. But MacArthur said that social justice was the greatest threat to the church that he had seen in his entire lifetime. He also authored a statement against social justice, the Dallas Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel. So to MacArthur, wokeness, social justice, CRT, this was all a huge deal. So because this was such a big deal to John MacArthur, the last time that these men were invited to Shepherds Conference, Mohler, Dever, and Duncan, obviously people understood that their positions didn't seem to line up. You know, MacArthur and Phil Johnson are here against all this stuff, and then these other guys, Dever, Mohler, and Duncan, seem to be, more sympathetic to it, and because of that, Phil Johnson pressured. The last time these men were at Shepherds Conference, Phil Johnson pressured them, and this is what happened. Watch.
Go back to what you said about incremental changes that promote that sort of liberalizing tendency, and realize that just last year at both the Gospel Coalition and Together for the Gospel, I was hearing some rhetoric that actually I first heard from Jim Wallace and Sojourners 20, 30 years ago. And so I think what I'm asking you is, in fact, what I am asking you is, do you not see that the evangelical movement, even our constituency, the most conservative end of the evangelical movement, is becoming a little more susceptible to that
But Phil, you've known me for a long time. You know the answer to the question is yes, but I'm not going to be forced into a situation before thousands of people in which I have to say I'm going to do it your way. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm just not. And if that's
Fair
a test
enough.
of fellowship amongst us, this will be a good time to find out.
Okay, so you can see that when they started talking about social justice and wokeness, Phil Johnson pressured Al Mohler and things got heated, right? Mohler brought up breaking fellowship live on stage in front of the ShepCon audience. So long story short, after this blow up in 2019, there seemed to be a clear divide. None of those men were ever invited back to the Shepherds Conference, at least not as long as John MacArthur was alive. But now that John MacArthur is gone, they are being invited back. So what seemed to be a test of fellowship, wokeness, social justice, it also seemed to disrupt fellowship. I mean, you saw the clip. That was pretty significant. But now all of that's being treated like, oh, well, that's in the past, and wokeness, it's all just a secondary issue because these guys are coming back for the new upcoming 2026 Shepherds Conference. So again, the fact that they're coming back and they're going to be platformed and promoted by Grace Community Church, obviously wokeness is being treated as a secondary issue. So what do you think about this? Is wokeness a secondary issue? First of all, whenever speakers from the Gospel Coalition, remember back in 2020 when TGC authors and speakers, when they talked about social justice, how many times did they call it a gospel issue? So they didn't treat it like it was secondary. They called it a gospel issue. I personally don't believe this is a secondary issue, and here's why. Not only does the other side not treat it as one, the New Testament does not divide doctrine and practice into primary issues versus secondary issues, not in the way that modern evangelicalism does. I know we talk like this sometimes. My point is not to make an issue out of everything, but you just don't see in the Bible the apostles picking their battles or making excuses. If they saw that something was potentially divisive, they addressed it head on. And certainly wokeness is about as divisive a subject as you can get. So unity, the point is unity in the New Testament is unity in the truth, not unity at all costs. So in the Bible, errors that we would call secondary often receive strong correction or even calls for separation. I'm going to give a few examples in a moment, but let me also quickly add this. I am not advocating for some sort of hyper-fundamentalism where people break fellowship over any little difference. I know people, not very many, but I've known people in the past. If someone has a different view over, say, the timing of the rapture, any little difference, anathematize that person, they're not even saved. And listen, that is the bad type of fundamentalism. So I'm not talking about that. But at the same time, I don't think that wokeness and social justice is a small issue. Not at all. So now let's listen to Phil Johnson. He's explaining why he thinks it's a good thing that some of these woke teachers are coming back to speak at the Shepherds Conference. Listen.
And I got to say, I like all of those guys. Al Mohler is the most interesting conversationalist I've ever shared a meal with. And I like him. I don't agree with him on everything, obviously. And that's true of the other guys as well. Ligon Duncan is the most gracious and friendly. I mean, you can't not love him if you know him. And Mark Dever has probably done more to disciple young guys than anybody else. And again, I don't agree with all of his ideas, and I'm sorry he blended wokeness into what he was training as young men. I don't think that was a huge mistake. And so I have disagreements with all those guys, but I love them. And I do. People should know that the choice of having those men come back to this year's Shepherds Conference was actually John MacArthur's. It's not like you see in social media people saying, well, John died and now they're bringing back all these guys that didn't agree with John on things. So what are the elders thinking? It wasn't like that at all. It was John. I mean, he brought back Piper last year. And Piper gave what I thought was the best eulogy on John MacArthur at his memorial service. So these guys are capable of delivering solid biblical stuff. That's what they'll do at the Shepherds Conference. They're not going to come in and peddle social justice or any of that. So I'm not fearful of that. I'm not opposed to having them. They're men who for years worked alongside John and agreed with him on many things. And this is their opportunity to express their agreements with John. And I think they'll do that. None of them are going to. When the suggestion was made in an elders meeting, that let's bring these guys back and let's do a panel discussion where they talk about their memories of John MacArthur. Some of them had done this. They had done this in some context with R.C. Sproul, where these men who had worked closely alongside him were giving their memories of Sproul. And it was a great hour of really edifying reminiscences about how effective Sproul was and why he was effective. And they wanted to do that for John, so let's get the guys who he labored most closely with, who were his best friends. And these are those guys. The one exception would be Sproul, and he's already dead, so he can't be part of the panel. And so they said, what if we do this? And in an elders meeting, they looked across at me and said, because I had this Q&A with these guys. They said, Phil, what do you think of this? And I said, I'm all in favor of it if you let me be the moderator of the discussion. And of course, everybody just laughed at that, that's a bad idea.
Okay, so I realize a lot of people are going to get stuck on the statements that he made that this was John MacArthur's idea. Obviously, there are some people questioning that. They say it doesn't make sense. What we know is that when John was alive, they were not, Piper's different, but the other guys were not invited back while he was alive. So, listen, I don't want to focus on that, but let's just go to what Phil said. Phil's justification. This really isn't so much about Phil, because I really do like Phil. I do think he is put in a difficult position, so this is nothing against Phil Johnson. As far as I can tell here, he is somewhat having to defend Grace Community Church. So Phil Johnson, in fairness, he is speaking, at least to some degree, on behalf of the elders of Grace Community Church. But part of his defense seems to be how likable these guys are. He says, I like these guys. And I don't know if that's part of his defense. Maybe it's just what he said, because I think his main argument comes later. But you notice that Phil Johnson said that he likes these guys. They're good conversationalists. Also, Mark Dever. Okay, Phil Johnson, this is important. Phil said that Mark Dever did blend in wokeness. Okay, but he's discipled a lot of people. So, is that really a justification of woke teachers? No, I don't think so. But Phil's main justification is, number one, that John wanted them to come back. Whether that's true or not, I would never call Phil a liar, so that not even implying that. But whether that's true or not, it almost doesn't even matter. Because whatever MacArthur said or didn't say, the question is still there. Is wokeness a secondary issue? Should it be treated that way? But number two, the other or the main justification that Phil gave is that they are not coming to Shepherds Conference to peddle wokeness. Of course, they could. Hasn't happened yet. But he says, no, they're not coming here to peddle wokeness. So his argument is that other than the woke stuff, these men are solid. That's what Phil Johnson is saying. Other than their wokeness, these men are very capable teachers. That's what he said. So in effect, because they've clearly made this decision to platform these men, in effect, their wokeness is being treated as, oh, well, we don't like it, but they're solid in other areas. So it is being treated as not that big of a deal. It's not big enough of a deal for us to separate because it's a secondary issue. We're going to platform them anyway. So we don't like it, but we can overlook it. That's the short of it. Okay, so is that right? Is that biblical? Because remember, in the first clip, when Phil tried to admonish them over their woke stance, Al Mohler wasn't having any of it. He refused the admonition. So based on what Phil said, it seems that now they've changed their position. They're going to let it slide. So with the time I have remaining, I want to appeal to you and anyone who's listening to this podcast. No, wokeness is not a secondary issue. We should not, nobody should be advocating for, promoting, platforming woke teachers. I don't think this is okay. And remember, it was clearly serious enough for Phil to pressure Al Mohler 6 years ago. It was clearly serious enough for John MacArthur to pen the Dallas Statement on social justice and the gospel. So if it was that serious back then, why is it being treated as a secondary thing right now? So let me give you some biblical arguments as to why this should not be allowed. This should not be allowed because the apostles, they didn't let anything slide, and neither should we. Okay, I'm not saying, nitpick every little difference. That's not what I'm saying. But for example, in 1 Timothy 4, Paul rebukes teachers who are telling people that they couldn't eat certain types of food. Paul calls this doctrines of demons. So wokeness, correct me if I'm wrong, but wokeness certainly seems more serious than telling people they couldn't eat certain types of meat. Maybe you don't agree, but I think you would have to agree that wokeness is divisive. In Titus 3:10, Paul said, reject a divisive person after the first and second warning. If someone is causing division by their teaching, you clearly warn them once, then a second time. After that, it's time to reject their ministry. That's the way it seems. At least don't platform them. Does that apply to these men? Obviously, the elders at Grace Community Church don't think it does. But I'll just say this, with Ligon Duncan, his wokeness has been so in your face. Because I always try to put, let's flip it around. If the details were different, would it matter? And yes, it would. Hear me out. Again, Ligon Duncan, his wokeness has been so in your face. Again, he wrote the foreword to the book Woke Church. That was 7 years ago. So he's had 7 years of people rebuking him, and he still won't listen. But Ligon Duncan talked about how black people, remember that clip? Have you seen this? Ligon Duncan said that black people cannot trust white people, and for good reason, he says. At what point do you say enough is enough? If that were flipped around, if he said that white people can't trust blacks for good reason, if it was racism against black people, nobody would tolerate it. But wokeness often comes out as racism against white people. Oh, but that's okay. So it's the double standards. Paul said, again, after the second admonition. So if it were racism against black people, discrimination against black people, that wouldn't be tolerated even before the first admonition. It wouldn't fly. But when it's racism against white people, hey, no problem. And in fact, let's write a whole book about it, So you have to realize, I think everyone has to admit that wokeness, social justice, CRT, this has the potential to divide the body of Christ. In fact, it already is dividing the body of Christ. And John MacArthur believed that. So why this turnaround? It just doesn't make sense. But here's another example, when it comes to secondary issues. 1 Corinthians 14:37, Paul says, the things that I write to you are the commands of the Lord. What was he talking about? Order of worship, tongues, prophecy, speaking one at a time. Today, these would be considered secondary issues, but Paul calls them the commands of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2, Paul instructs the church to maintain the traditions. Then he goes on to talk about things in chapter 11 that just about everybody today considers minor secondary issues, at least the first half of the chapter. And yet, maybe third-tier issues, people would say, but Paul presents them as what? Uniform apostolic tradition, not open to casual modification. Paul is telling people, you need to follow this. This is the apostolic tradition. Follow it. Also, one more example, 2 Thessalonians 3:6. In other words, he's not saying, Corinthians, this is a secondary issue, so let's not worry about it. You never see anything like that in the Bible. 2 Thessalonians 3:6, keep away from any brother who walks in idleness. So we see that even laziness and being disorderly were important enough to warrant distancing. In verse 14, Paul says, do not even keep company with them. And I could go on, but hopefully you see the point. If the apostles were willing to take a hard stance on things that we would consider secondary or third tier issues, if that's true, how can we treat wokeness as though it's no big thing? How can we treat wokeness as though it's a secondary issue? I don't believe we can. So in conclusion, hopefully you can see that the apostles did not treat doctrine or practice casually, and neither should we. And just so we're clear, I never said that GCC, Grace Community Church, Grace to You, I never said they should pass judgment on these men. I only say this because I know it's going to come up in the comment section, but I never said anything about judging their salvation or something. I'm not even broaching that topic. Rather, my main point is that sound pastors in sound churches should not be platforming and promoting woke teachers. Period. End of discussion. And if you say, well, it's not a big deal because it's only a secondary issue, I couldn't disagree with that more. So last thing I'll say, I did attend the Shepherds Conference in 2020. I thought it was really good, but there is no way I would attend in 2026. Not with this lineup. But let me know what you think in the comments section. If you agree, type amen. If you don't agree, let me know why. But until next time, may the Lord be with you and have a great day.